Welcome everyone. Greetings from the Australian National University in Canberra. My name is Jay and I look after international relations and partnerships here at the ANU in the areas of sciences, health and medicine. Joining me, of course, today is our speaker, Dr. Will Grant. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the traditional owners of the land where ANU is located, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, let me very quickly introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Will Grant. Will is a senior lecturer in science communication at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science here at the ANU. He has won many awards for his public policy and outreach work and has authored and co-authored works in various highly regarded journals. I will not list them all here. If I did so, that would not be a short introduction. Now, Will also writes regularly in high impact public facing outlets. That includes The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, my personal favorite, The Conversation, Times Higher Education, The Canberra Times, The Brisbane Times, Crikey, The Drum, Climate Spectator, ABC Environment, and many more. Will is regularly heard on the national radio discussing science for Research Filter and Nightlife, as well as podcasting in The Holsham Show and Good Day Patriots, both of which have charted in the Australian iTunes Top 50. Will is also a co-founder of the research employment service PostAC and has held science communication workshops for a range of Australia's leading science organisations, universities and government departments. Now, I'm super excited for this talk. So therefore, without any further delay, I'll now hand over to Dr. Will Grant to tell us about misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic and what could science communicators do about it. Over to you, Will.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here this evening, this afternoon, depending on what time zone you are in. As Jay did before, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are speaking from, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to recognise the places you are coming from. It's fantastic that during this time of stress, we have been able to reach out to partners, institutions around the world, do talks like this for people all over the place. But we do want to recognise that we are all in slightly different situations regarding the pandemic, where we're up to, how things are going, and what our local situation is. So we would very much like to recognise where you are in the middle of this. And I want to just say from the start that we will be talking a little bit about some of the things that happened during the pandemic, some of the things that were communicated during the pandemic. And I want to recognise that some of this may be distressing material for some. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do recognise you may be in a space that is different from where we are here in Canberra. Now, before I dive in, I just wanted to do a little bit to explain the context of the centre that I work in. So the centre that I work in, that Jay introduced just before, is the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. The key bit's there, public awareness of science. The other bit is just the formal things that connect with the university. But what I wanted to introduce about us is our goal is to understand the relationship between science and society, to understand around the world where science is connecting well with the rest of the world, where people are listening to the lessons of science and doing what is asked, or taking that into policymaking circles or in their own health decisions, all of those kinds of things. Our goal is to understand the places where it's working well, and also the places where it doesn't work well. Those places where scientific information perhaps doesn't get to people that need it, to policymakers that need it, or there are some sort of barriers. Our goal in understanding this is, firstly, of course, to understand. We are researchers and we love to just understand things. But the second thing, we do a lot of work around the world, around Australia, trying to help people to understand why there are places where science isn't taken up, where people might have difficulty with science, where the advice of science hits some sort of a barrier. Our goal then is to help scientists to get across that barrier. And I think the one thing that I just want to start this whole talk on is to acknowledge that COVID-19 has been an amazing but horrible lesson for all of us. It's been horrible, of course. We've all lived through really tough times, but the fascinating thing about it, it tells us how our society works. It has told us around the world how our societies have worked. It's shown us places where we've done remarkably well, places where we've come together, where we've all fought the pandemic, where we've learnt so much. It's also shown us places that we might need to fix, places where we might need to look at how things have happened in the past and change. Now, I know my colleagues in public health or in immunology or virology all have so many things that they will talk to you about or talk to other people about, so many things that they have learned. But we focus on communication. And I think, like them, the pandemic will probably be one of the biggest examples of success and failure of communication for many years to come. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you a little bit about misinformation during the pandemic. Now, I'm going to share my screen and I will tell you two stories. One of them is a story that happened during the pandemic. One of them is a much older story, but it tells me something interesting. And then my goal after that will be to weave them together and ask some questions about misinformation in the time of COVID. Now, I'll go through this. If you have questions at any point, please throw them there in the Q&A. I will try and get to them either at the end or later. And if I can find my mouse, I don't know why my mouse disappears when I want it to find it. I'll just double check my speakers are on, as my microphone is on as much as I can do, but hopefully you can all hear me well. If you have questions throughout, jump on and I will attempt to answer. Otherwise, at the end of the talk, I'm very happy to answer lots of questions, and we can also talk about various aspects of learning science communication at ANU. I will also, as Jay said, talk to you a little bit, ask some questions of you throughout. So, the first story of misinformation in the time of COVID. I want to introduce you to this guy. He's this guy. He's the kind of guy that wears a hat that looks like that. He's probably well-meaning. I don't know much more about him, but I do know that between the years of about 2016 and 2019, he was teaching English in the Chinese city of Wuhan. His name is Connor Reed, and Connor had been there for 3 years. He was an English guy who had gone out there to teach English and was, by all accounts, having an enjoyable time. But like many people at that time and in that city, Connor started to feel sick. December 2019. He developed all of the symptoms that we now know associate with COVID-19, but this is long before the disease was even registered or was even known about in the city of Wuhan. He developed a sniffle, he developed a cough, he had a fever. And so, like any sensible person, although I'm not entirely sure of Connor's sensibility, and we'll come to that in a second, he took himself off to hospital. But while he was there in hospital, Connor made the first decision that I think we can reflect on a little bit later. The first thing he did was the Chinese authorities offered him a variety of medicines. And these are medicines that you would give to anyone in an acute respiratory issue. But Connor said no. Connor had his own ideas about how he would look after himself. I am not sure at this point why Connor said no to the medicines. That can be drilled into later, but I think it is one of those things that we within the world of science communication are always attempting to explore when people say yes or no to the advice of their doctors. But nevertheless, that's not the key story here. The key story is that while Connor rejected the medicines that were offered to him by the Chinese doctors, he had instead what's called a hot toddy. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with a hot toddy, it is I think it's a fairly traditional Scottish drink, perhaps. It's based on Scottish ingredients. Whiskey, honey, lemon, and then some spices. Traditionally, a lot of people in the United Kingdom or in Scotland have treated themselves to a hot toddy if they are feeling a little bit under the weather, like they have a little bit of a cold. I'm sure it's nice. I have had one or two myself, and I'm sure it is wonderful when you have a light cold. Whether it is a treatment against COVID or not, well, there is no evidence, and it is not a treatment against COVID. However, Connor's symptoms were, to begin with, only moderate. There was no point at which Connor's symptoms progressed to a level that was actually worrying for him or for anyone. So he got better. Now, there you go, Connor, feeling much better. coming out of hospital. And that was a good news story for him. For him, it meant time out of hospital and back to his semi-normal life. Little did he know what was about to happen around the corner. First poll question. I want to ask you now, how big of a problem has misinformation been during the pandemic? Now, Jay, if you can open the poll, and then let's see how long. Oh, I get to vote too. I won't vote. We'll give you 30 seconds or so to vote. Has misinformation been a huge problem? Something to worry about, but not necessarily a huge problem. Or perhaps it's a little bit overblown. What do you think? How many votes have we got, Jay?
About 70% of the people have voted.
Ah, kicking goals. Well, another 10 seconds and that'll be good.
Yeah.
I'm actually fascinated. I don't know what your opinions will be. I'm torn myself. Very interesting. 69% of you said it's a huge problem. 28% said something to worry about, and 3% said it's a little overblown. I have to confess that I myself, I move between all three of those positions. Even though I study misinformation, there are times when I think, is this going too far? Is this a moral panic where we're all a bit talking ourselves into a wild scenario? Other times, and I'll complete this story in a second, it has been horrific. I do think about this question, and I want to say there is no right answer here. One thing I will tell you though is some recent data here in Australia. A survey was done looking at a variety of different social issues here in Australia. And one of the questions that was asked, what are the biggest problems facing us here in Australia? You can imagine many of the usual ones: climate change, or potentially international terrorism, or economic threats, or domestic level problems that we do have to deal with, such as rising inequality, or other sorts of things like that. But the problem that came out number one was misinformation. I was a little bit surprised, but nevertheless. Back to Connor. So Connor got better. He had a moderate case of what came to be known as COVID-19, although he didn't actually know it was COVID-19 until much later. He was told this much later. But he had a moderate case and he went home, telling the story of his hot toddy as being a key part of his recovery. Now, the interesting thing here is that for some reason and in some way, Connor's story got picked up by the media. Here it is a few days later. So this is February. He was initially sick in December 2019, and then January in hospital. And so he came out of hospital. Perhaps he told his friends on a social media network. Perhaps he told his mum. Perhaps he told someone. But pretty quickly, the story got out, not just of him getting better, but of how he beat deadly flu with a glass of hot whiskey and honey. From this point, the story went everywhere. Early on in the pandemic, things were getting worrying around the world. A lot of places, a lot of people were starting to panic about what this disease was when we still knew it as a coronavirus and we hadn't declared it COVID-19, when we hadn't declared it a pandemic yet. This story went rapidly all around the world. Poll number 2. Have you personally seen misinformation being shared? And Jay, if we can open up poll number 2. I'm going to confess, I know that I have seen misinformation being shared, so that's good.
So we've got 2 questions in this poll. We're also asking.
I'll use that chance to have a look at these questions then. Volume, kind of fine now. I'll talk as loud as I can. I don't know what I can do to raise my volume. Actually.
No, that's okay. That's all good. It's just in the poll. We're asking, have you personally seen misinformation? And then
yep.
Who was it who shared?
Yep.
As well. We've had 80% of the words, so I'll go ahead and stop.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see. 93%, fantastic. Who was it who shared the information? Older relatives, relatives and friends your own age, strangers, all of the above. Okay, that's fantastic. I am not pleased that 93% of you have personally seen misinformation being shared. But I want to ask a question. And here, we can just use the Q&A function, if I can. No. I would just like to, if I can pull up the Q&A function, but unfortunately my mouse is going weird. What I'd like to know is, do you have any examples that we could talk through? Have you seen misinformation? What was it? Where did you see it? While I try to bring my mouse back to. So put it, Booze Cures COVID in the WhatsApp group, fantastic. Other examples that people saw, misinformation on the origin of the disease. My friend posted on Instagram and believed masks increase the rate of infection. Steam inhalation 3 times a day would kill the virus. Actually, I've definitely seen a few of these. Banlan Jen, sorry, I don't understand that one. A WhatsApp group. Someone told me that N95 masks are meant for people who cannot breathe. Use of spices to recover from COVID. Direct sun kills the virus. I definitely remember that one. I can click, there we go. The virus is government propaganda. Many people have heard that. Use of spices. Okay. Fantastic. Drinking hot water will kill the virus. It's interesting. Misinformation on girls of 18 years old cannot take the vaccine on WhatsApp. Once you're vaccinated, wearing masks is unnecessary. Another piece of misinformation, especially political leaders and on social too, spreading it. Yeah, no doubt. An older relative had sent on a family WhatsApp group that the virus is manufactured, that it's a biological weapon, that cow urine can kill the virus isn't real. Vaccines are a way of putting microchips in our bodies, kind of traditional herbal medicine. The Chinese invented the virus, misinformation. Fantastic. These are all great. Now, I don't know how to dismiss these, Jay. Let me know if I need to do anything here. What I do want to say is, I think it's fascinating, first and foremost, that despite the incredibly international nature of the coronavirus, there are some quirks that would be locally, some misinformation that is locally oriented, but a lot of this is shared globally. A lot of these questions are the questions and the types of misinformation that we have seen around the world. And I think it's a fascinating point that suddenly we are living in a world where not only our information is globally shared, but so too our misinformation. Fantastic. Back to Connor. Connor's story spread all around the world. And I think if we remember back to the start of the pandemic, it's worth remembering that the early days of the pandemic, where Connor was, and in early 2020, the pandemic, or not yet a pandemic, I'm afraid, the coronavirus that came to be known as COVID-19, was originally a phenomenon that was only happening in China. Whilst the rest of the world was paying attention, the first cases, the first 100,000 or so cases, nearly the first 100,000 or let's say definitely the first 60,000 cases, all occurred within China and all quite closely close in the area of Hubei province there. But by late February and in early March, the rest of the world was very much paying attention and we're starting to see the first few outbreaks in other parts of the world. Yes, there were cases that people saw in the US and in Japan and in Singapore, but the first 3 countries that really saw significant outbreaks were Iran, Italy, and South Korea. I don't have the dates exactly right on this, but very soon after, in late February, early March, we started to see big jumps of cases in Iran, Italy, and South Korea. Suddenly, the coronavirus went from being a problem that China was experiencing to a problem that 4 countries were experiencing. Obviously, we know later it became much more global than that. The end of the story that I want to tell about Connor's story is that this went into Iran. Connor's idea of using a hot toddy to beat the pandemic, to beat the virus, went viral in Iran, particularly on WhatsApp groups and other messaging platforms like that. I'll skip that one because we've already asked that. Now, one of the significant complicating factors here is that Iran is, of course, a country where alcohol is banned. And so many people made alcohol in unregulated backyard stills. In the midst of the pandemic, more than 700 people in Iran died following alcohol poisoning. Many people thought that alcohol would be a solution to the fears that the coronavirus pandemic was bringing about. Many people thought alcohol could cure them, could ward off the coronavirus. At least 700 people, many of them children, died. So whenever anyone asks me, is misinformation overblown? Is this a problem that maybe we're having a bit of a moral panic about? That maybe there's too much. Maybe there are other problems that we need to focus on first. I say yes and no, because I'm still torn on it. But I do say there are absolutely times where misinformation can cause catastrophic problems. I raise this example because on the other side, there are innocuous forms of misinformation. So for example, the horoscope that might be printed in a daily newspaper, or ideas about whether the world is flat. They might not stack up with scientific information, but no one is dying because of a horoscope. No one is dying because of a flat earth belief. They might not stack up with science, absolutely. And our job as science communicators and scientists is to think about those things, but not always to go out and rebut them. But in this example, lots of deaths did occur and misinformation was the problem. So I turn back to that, how big of a problem has misinformation been during the pandemic? And the thing I want to say there is that misinformation matters, but not all misinformation matters equally. The reason I raise this is because one of the things that we attempt to do in our field of science communication is to understand, when does it matter? Which are the cases, which are the situations where we should say, this is a problem? The reason I raise this is that we have limited amounts of energy if we are to combat misinformation, to combat disinformation, to look at all of the problems out there and to do something about it. We only have so much energy. Which are the cases that we should spend our energy on? That's one of the big questions that we're asking here at the Centre for Public Awareness of Science, to attempt to understand which bits of misinformation are the ones that we should really spend our energy on. But the next story I want to tell complicates this. Now, this is not a COVID story, but the parallels are strong, and there are some COVID stories that I will point to at the end that parallel. So poll number 4, how confident are you at identifying misinformation?
We'll give everyone maybe 10 more seconds.
Cool. Interesting, very interesting. 8% very confident. 61% pretty confident. I think I'd put myself in there, I don't know. But 31%, which is absolutely fair, I'm not sure at all. Now, there isn't a right answer here. There isn't a right answer. I'm here just to try and raise questions, because it would be great if we were all super confident at identifying misinformation, and maybe there are paths through to try and work that out. But I think it's fascinating that our range of confidence is always a little bit unclear. And so the story I want to tell you is a story that resonates for me, because it's a moment where I was shocked. I was shocked to learn something new. The War of the Worlds. War of the Worlds is a 19th century novel, I think written the year before or the year after Dracula, in which aliens invade. They take out Earth to a point, and then we survive. The original by H.G. Wells. It's a great novel. You may have seen, there has been movie and TV adaptations many a year since then. I think there was a BBC one 2 years ago. There was a Tom Cruise version about 10 years ago. We have adapted this book into movies and TV and radio plays many times. Perhaps the most famous was a weird one. It was a radio play done in the 1930s by this guy, Orson Welles. Orson Welles is one of the standouts of Hollywood. In all of the lists of great films of all time, his film, Citizen Kane, very often comes near the top. It's an old movie and perhaps a little bit different to modern tastes. I think if we're used to watching things like The Avengers, if we went and watched Citizen Kane, we might think, wow, this is a very slow movie. But it's amazing to look back at a 1930s movie and realize how much of modern cinema Orson Welles invented. But the thing to say about Orson Welles is that he was beyond just an inventive cinematographer and director. He had an amazing way of telling stories and creating new ways to tell stories. Now, in the 1930s, a popular form of family entertainment was to sit around and listen to the radio. This was the time before TV. Cinema existed, but you could only do cinema on your Friday nights or your Saturday nights or something like that. But many families would sit around and listen to the radio, and probably larger communities too. One of the most interesting forms of radio at the time, obviously there was the news and the sport, but radio dramas. Radio dramas were a very common thing for people to do. Now here's where the story gets interesting. In the 1930s, Orson Welles decided to adapt the War of the Worlds story for a radio play for people to listen to. And he told the story of aliens invading, people running into the street, getting shocked, an amazing apparatus, fear, danger, all of those kinds of things in the format of a radio news broadcast. The story is that people listened to this potential news broadcast, the idea that aliens were in the streets of America, and ran out into the streets in panic. Suddenly, there were people all over the streets, panicked that the aliens were invading, that we're all about to die and we had to do something about it. The next morning, newspapers ran headlines about this naughty Orson Welles, this man who had made a radio play so fake but so compelling that it shocked people out into street. Fake radio war stirs terror throughout the US. Radio play terrifies the nation. For a long time, I've held on to that story because for me, one of the forms of research that I'm very interested in is how communication will get responses. How, if you say the right thing or the wrong thing, you can lead to mass panic, mass hysteria. Mass panics and mass hysteria are legitimate things to study, and they are important things. We actually do really want to understand what happens in a mass psychosis event, because these things do happen, and we do need to attempt to bring some policy solutions here to do better the next time. So we use this as sort of the first, the biggest, the clearest story of mass panic. when suddenly people fearful of aliens ran out into the streets. But here's the thing. It's fake. It's fake. It never happened. So the key bit that did happen is that, yes, there was an original War of the Worlds story. And yes, in the 1930s, Orson Welles adapted it into a radio play and lots of people did listen. But here's the thing. No one ran out into the streets. Barely anyone actually listened. And no one thought that aliens were actually invented. The actual thing that happened is that the newspapers were annoyed at this modern media, the radio, annoyed at the radio and said, hang on, this isn't right. Something should be done about this. And instead of actually reporting the panic, they told about a fake panic. They said that the radio play had terrified the nation and they drummed up stories of a mass panic. This is all a form of misinformation. And the thing that this says to me is that for years, as an academic, for many years, I passed on this piece of misinformation. It was a lie. It was a lie and I passed it on. And I read about this earlier this year and it shocked me. It shocked me because it said to me how easily I had passed on that piece of misinformation. This is one of the questions that we're trying to answer here at the Center for Public Awareness of Science. How is it that we, even we who believe we understand misinformation and know when to stop it and know when to point it out, even we fall for it? I use this example because there are quite a few examples that continue to emerge during the COVID pandemic of things that might be misinformation or might not. Now, I'm not going to point to all of these because some of the things I'm going to raise in a second are definitely misinformation. Others are on the fence. Some have been treated unfairly as misinformation when in fact they might not be. Bleach. We had an American president who said, maybe we could inject bleach. I'll let you in on a secret. That one's definitely misinformation. Alcohol. Well, alcohol is very important in hand sanitizers, but yes, alcohol was a dangerous form of misinformation during the pandemic. Silver. Yeah, a lot of people did say, well, not a lot of people, but some people said that silver might be a form of protecting against the virus. Masks. This is a difficult one because we now know that masks have played a key role in limiting the spread of the virus. But early on, there was significant debate in the scientific community about whether people should wear masks or not. And that definitely caused some confusion, may have contributed to the spread of the pandemic. If the advice early on had been that we should wear masks, then perhaps things would have been different. Vitamin D. I haven't done this story, but it's a fascinating one where early on in the pandemic, an utterly fake science story was published saying that vitamin D contributed to people's treatment and getting better after the virus. Turns out that that study was entirely fake. No one had done it, and anyone who was involved were made up people. And yet, it wormed its way into policy responses around the world. Aerosols. Is COVID-19 an aerosol, or is it a droplet? It's a fascinating question, and the answer isn't actually answered with clear science because the boundary between the two could be a form that confuses. I won't go into that, but it is another question. And of course, the big one that is going around now, the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is another area where at one stage we may have felt we had certainty. Now the questions have been opened again. So what I would challenge you is those of us who are confident in knowing when we're up against misinformation, perhaps ask a few questions, spread a bit of doubt, because there remain many things that we can be confident about that may not be the case in the future. So what is the research that we're doing on misinformation at the Center for the Public Awareness of Science? There are a range of different questions that we are attempting to ask and to answer. Our goal in all of this is to understand what is going on in misinformation and to understand what we can do about it, both from a research perspective, but also as humans involved in this loop of misinformation. So, who shares misinformation? The answer here, sadly, is all of us. Yes, there are certainly more credulous groups. We know that people who are less information literate are more likely to share things that are not very credible, sorry. We know that perhaps older people who have got onto the internet and have joined a Facebook group might be a little bit more credulous about the claims of QAnon or something like that. But misinformation is not just those groups. Just about everyone shares misinformation at some stage. Where do we share it? Interesting thing here is that social media is a big part of misinformation, but there are actually many other ways in which misinformation is shared. One of the questions that we want to look at is, how does misinformation spread in offline networks when people talk face to face to each other? That's a great way that communication happens, but very difficult to document. Why do we fall for it? And again, this is the other side to that. Why do we share it? This is fascinating. Even when we might think it's misinformation, we sometimes fall for things. Usually because the emotion is right, or it came from a trusted source, or because it's something that we want to help people to know. I looked once at rumors that spread during the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of those rumors talked very clearly about, I will try and answer that question in a second, it just popped up. A lot of those rumors spoke about coming lockdowns, quite fearful rumors out there on social media saying, look, the army's coming in, we're all gonna go into lockdowns. At the time, they were treated like misinformation. And yet we knew countries around the world went into forms of lockdown where people were asked to stay home. Why do we fall for it? Why do we share it? Because in situations of low information but high uncertainty, we grasp for any information that we have and we pass it on to the people that we care about. Finally, what can we do about it? We are, as researchers, practically oriented. Whilst all research is about understanding the nature of things, and we very much at ANU and at the Centre for Public Awareness of Science do seek to understand the nature of things, we always add to that. We always think at our centre, but what can we do about it? How can we take our knowledge out to scientists, out to policymakers, out to those people who make decisions and give them something to do? We very much believe that doing something about it is a key part of doing research. So I'm going to conclude just with a final study, and then I'll come and answer questions because I'd love to have a chat with you. This final study came out just a couple of days ago that unfortunately, overconfidence in news judgments is associated with false news susceptibility. This suggests that people who are confident about being able to assess whether they are falling for misinformation or not actually associates with falling for it. What does that mean for us? I used to be confident, now I'm not. Thank you very much. I'd love to turn over and answer questions. So, I don't know, I'll jump out of this slideshow and stop sharing. There was a question there, it went there. So Payal, while listening, I could not help but think about the psychological concept of cognitive dissonance in humans and how that might play a major role in spreading misinformation during COVID times. Like, even there is no scientific evidence to support these home remedies that are spread across various media platforms, but we are more inclined to share them in the hopes of eradicating the pandemic. What are your thoughts on this? Absolutely, absolutely. There are a whole range of psychological concepts, biases, and ways of that our brains are structured that play a huge role in spreading misinformation. And so cognitive dissonance is absolutely one of them. And I think the key thing here is people will share things regardless of whether there is scientific evidence for them. They will share because they trust the source or because they want to look after people. I think it's really important. One of the pieces of research that we are always attempting to do is to sit between different areas and weave together what is known from different areas. Key thing in misinformation is that it will not be solved only by psychologists or computer scientists or sociologists or news media studies or anything like that. We need to actually weave together the insights of all of those different bodies of knowledge and bring them all to bear. Okay, next question. What are your thoughts about key people such as scientists accidentally sharing misinformation? It is difficult. It's really difficult because absolutely knowledgeable people do share misinformation accidentally. I think the only thing that we can do there is to acknowledge, this is a Churchill quote. So the original, I don't like Churchill quotes because Churchill has a lot of problems, but Churchill said that the problems of democracy can only be solved by more democracy. And I think that's good. I think it's good. It says, you know, we live in imperfect democracies. Perhaps more democracy will be the solution. Anyway, my version of that is that the problems of science will only be solved by more science. And so what this means is there will come many times where a paper slips through peer review when it is not good, or a scientist says something that is not as peer reviewed or as close to the facts as we might hope. That's the process of science. What we would say is that over time, it is self-correcting. More science, more examination, we will come to a place where we are closer to the truth. But it does mean that in the interim, we scientists should attempt to be as careful as we can about whether we are sharing misinformation or not. But those scientists are in attention, because in an urgent situation, we don't want to wait forever. We do need to give people advice. We do need to say, look, the best thing to do right now is this. And it's difficult. So recognize its attention and then err on the side of caution is the number one things that I would always say. So while there is a debate about whether social distancing or wearing masks is, if the science is fully not in yet on, then I think we can still say, let's err on the side of wear them until we have more knowledge. How do you communicate peer-reviewed scientific information published in leading journals? Retraction later. Absolutely. You've pointed to a really interesting case. This is the MMR study that was published in The Lancet in the 1990s that pointed to an association between autism and the MMR vaccine. Turns out that study was a terrible study. It was absolutely unethical. It was a tiny sample size, and all of the data actually didn't point in the direction that the original author said it did. But it became a key part of the discourse, and a lot of people still cite it. It's causing problems still. This is tough. Good peer review makes a big difference, and we really need to try to help our colleagues, help our journals to do that good peer review to get to the right place. It's tough. It's tough. I don't have an answer to that one, but I think it's a really important point. The other thing to remember is that it takes time to do peer review. And during a pandemic, there is an urgency priority. We do want to get results out as soon as we can. We do want to have people saying, okay, what can we do? What do we need to do? And so there will be scientists putting their work into various archives, things like that. Preprint archives that say hasn't been peer reviewed, but it's good to get out into a wider community. That's part of science as well. I think long term that having science in preprint archives that lots of people can look through, we will find ways to embed peer review, ongoing peer review into those things. I think the thing is that over the long term, we move towards a better understanding of the world, but there will absolutely be hiccups along the way. Is there a difference between information and misinformation for a layperson, or are they the same? To all intents and purposes, they are the same. They behave the same in our brains. There is no difference for us until we know that they are not true. So that misinformation can only be diagnosed from outside. If someone says X to their friend, that's misinformation or information, but their friend will hear it, their friend will process it based on all of the things they know, have known, and what they want, and all of those kinds of things, and that will go into their brain the same way. So there is no difference, sadly. There's nothing that we can diagnose about it, except one of my favorite quotes for another quote that's very useful for understanding science is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Anything that stands a long way outside from the norm, the idea of bleach being a solution to COVID, nothing ever has pointed to that. That's an extraordinary claim. That requires extraordinary evidence. I think that we should all just err on the side of thinking, let's wait for the extraordinary evidence on that one. What can we do to disprove these misinformations which have been spread amongst a large group of people? Yeah, really important. There's a couple of things that we can all do. First, if you see things that you're not sure about on social media, don't share them. Go and look for further qualification or clarification. Try and understand them. Listen to the things that your friends and family and relatives are saying. Now, it is difficult. They might not listen to you on this, but notice when they are saying things that is misinformation. But here's the thing. Don't spend all of your time combating everything. Don't spend your time combating the minor, innocuous, non-dangerous pieces of misinformation that perhaps aren't going to make any difference. Focus on the things that are going to make a difference. I think, if your friends and family disbelieve in the pandemic entirely and go out and do dangerous things, absolutely pull them up. But if they're saying things like something to do with the horoscope, I think there's bigger fish to fry than that. What are your thoughts on punishments for spreading misinformation? Here I will pull a definitional difference. There is misinformation, which is things that shown to be false, that's being spread, and disinformation. Disinformation is something that people know to be false and spread it anyway. We used to call those lies, but anyway. I think that in general, we've got to be really careful about putting in punishments for misinformation. There will be people with good intent who believe, I'm trying to help my friends. I'm trying to give them good information. I'm trying to look after them. And if it turns out to be wrong, that's sad and it may cause problems. Absolutely. We do need to try and stop misinformation, but punishments only go with intention. I mean, absolutely. In general, in jurisprudence, punishments go with intention. And so disinformation, which is knowingly untrue, I think absolutely. We do need to work against those, and they may be punishable, and in many regimes they are. Basically, that's spreading lies and deliberately lying to get people to do things they otherwise wouldn't. Absolutely. I got no problem with that. Let's work out how much they are, but disinformation is punishable. I've thought about the misinformation that could be unknowingly shared by someone who has good background in the subject, who's the individual's subjective interpretation of the data published from a validated journal. What are your thoughts on how to tackle this? This is a fascinating question because it talks a little bit about the history and philosophy of science, which is an area that we work in and we work with, because we do want to understand the nature of science historically and how it's worked. One of the key things is that an individual who knows a lot about an area can be wrong and can stay wrong for a very long time, and it is very hard to change their minds. The classic examples of this are things like the theory of plate tectonics, which took a long time to work its way through fields of serious geological inquiry. So there were geologists, geophysicists, people who studied the planetary systems who did not believe in plate tectonics for many decades. And their colleagues, their junior colleagues usually, tried to argue with them, tried to point the evidence to them, and they disbelieved it. You know what it took to win the argument? It's sad. It's the fact that they just waited, and eventually all of those people retired. And then all of the young guard, all of the new people who believed in the new theory, they became the dominant group. There are groups of people who are knowledgeable in a subject who it is very hard to change their minds. The idea of Karl Popper that science happens by new facts emerging and suddenly people changing their minds is just not the way it happens, sadly. Sadly, people who know a lot can be really entrenched in their views. Misinformation surrounding COVID-19 does not bode well for public trust in science in the future as well. Please share your thoughts regarding repercussions in the future. Yeah, look, it's not good, but I think we are in a place now where we're recognizing that truth on the internet matters, but is hard. I think we're recognizing now that as much as our institutions, media, science, justice can, then we would like to orient them towards addressing misinformation and stopping it. Doesn't mean it'll be easy, but I do think in some senses this has been a bit of a high watermark of a pandemic and social media. I think if there is another pandemic in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, perhaps things might go a bit better. I don't know. Let's cross our fingers on that one. What do you think about the use of different types of masks? Does it really help to eradicate COVID? Well, I ain't no mask scientist on this one. All I'll say is listen to the public health advice of your local health authorities. We here in Australia are in a situation right now where there's pretty low community spread. And so we're not required to wear masks in very many settings, but absolutely, I'm wearing a mask when I get on a plane. Why some people at the source of misinformation knowingly conjure up false stories? I'm not talking about stories we're doubtful about or are sharing from a source we're trusting. I'm talking about information that's totally false or made up, and it travels a lot faster than true information. There's multiple reasons people do it. People do it for financial ends. Absolutely, there are people that share false news about on the stock market and make some money. There's strategic ends. We know that that Vladimir Putin in Russia has spent a fair bit of time whipping up certain sorts of disinformation on the internet that helped some people get elected in America and in the UK. We know people do it for personal ends. These are the sorts of ends that people spread lies for. They will spread lies because they want to make money, or they want to get power, or they want to some other sort of thing. It's a classic thing. People have been doing it for millennia. It's just different now because we have social media that we can spread them around the world. Is it good to give people some hope, which can be a little bit misinformation? Ha, that's great. I'll answer it this way, that one of the tangential issues of our discipline in science communication is how much should we worry about hype in science? So for example, pick a brand new scientific technology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, things like that. How much are the claims that are made about those things hype, misinformation, or lying? It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Sometimes people will say AI, artificial intelligence, is the tool of the future and will solve all of these problems. Some of that is false. It's never going to be as perfect as they say, but some of that is probably the duty of the scientist to say, look at this future picture. If we invest in this, if we go in this direction, we can do great things. So I do believe there is a role for, I won't call it misinformation, I'll call it hype, but speculating about future possibilities. Hope is an important thing. I'm not gonna talk against that. If we only talk ever in rational things that we can know about the universe, and we do know about the universe, we're never gonna get anywhere. That's a tricky one. It's a good question though. What about big pharma, big money skewing research? Say rejecting HCQ, I don't know what that is, as no evidence, etc., because they wanted to push cocktails that they produce. This happens even today. Absolutely. I'm not going to confirm anything fully about that. I don't know, but what I will say is that, of course, money, finance plays a big role in the global geopolitical, medical, scientific complex. And we have to recognize that as part of the landscape, and that potentially there are people that might push in certain sorts of directions, but I can't give much more on that. What role does science communication play in people developing inhibitions about vaccinations? Absolutely. It's a key role of science communication to attempt to work with people to understand why people might be vaccine hesitant and what we can do about that. Now, historically, there's been 150 years of people, 200 years of people being vaccine hesitant, some of the time for quite strong reasons. Now, not for strong reasons, but well, strongly held reasons that are not backed up by science. What I will say is that our first goal in science communication is not to spend time telling people they're wrong or that they're bad or that they're morally doing problematic things, but instead to understand why they might think those things, and then attempting to understand what we can do to help them to get to a place that is better for them and better for the wider community. We certainly in Australia have a problem with people that are vaccine hesitant and what we can do about it in terms of the virus. I know that globally it's an issue too. That's a key area for science communication research. Now, Jay, it's 5:29. I can answer one more question, or we can. I can thank you. We can thank everyone here.
Entirely up to you, Bill. You can pick what you would like to take.
All right, I'll answer one more question, but then it's time for me to go and have my din-dins because then I got to take the kids to basketball and things like that. What about the unverified information, which may be misinformation spread by someone who may be highly influential, like a politician? Shouldn't they be made to take responsibility? I'm thinking of a clear example here, a big example over in America, and they have found it very difficult to make that politician take responsibility. Yes, they should. Are they able to? That's another question in general. Politicians, sadly, work in different worlds from you and I. On that point, I'm going to say thank you so much to Jay for organizing, and thank you. I'm pointing at your questions because that's where they are on my screen, but I'm pointing at you. Thank you so much for joining in and asking these really interesting questions. Probably should have stopped earlier so we could talk more questions. So I'm Will Grant, Centre for Public Awareness of Science. We'd love to see you in ANU when we open our borders.
Thank you very much, Will. And on behalf of all those attending, thank you once again. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, information. I'm sure people can and will find you. You're on your website. If you're interested in the research that happens, at CPAS or what Will does, do go and look him up there. And
cool.
Yes, so thanks, Will.
Thank you. Oh, Jay, if you want to send you can send my podcast around to all these people, and if they want to listen podcasts. We talk about this stuff all the time. I
will do. I'll share that with the recording. So thank you everyone for coming in for those questions. We've got 2 more weeks of other guest lectures on various other sciences. So yeah, if you haven't registered, please do. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow or during the week.
See you all later.